This next session attempts the impossible. It is explaining how the EU works. And this will try Fukami from Chaos Computer Club and Kirsten Fiedler, Managing Director of European Digital Rights. Thank you that you're here.
Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to our little talk about the European Union. The purpose of this talk is to explain how the European, or what the European Union is, what players are there, and how to influence politics on that level. We are going to have, this is a very dry talk. Sorry for that, but we try to make it as as understandable as possible, and we still hope that you can take something out of it. So the main question is, how do I talk to the right people at the right time about the right topic? So we are going through all the EU stuff, and then the structure of the EU, and then we are going to talk about an actual policy, which is the European Data Protection Regulation that was just agreed upon a couple of weeks ago. The European Union is it's not all of Europe, it's only a couple of states, including some areas in Africa and South America. It doesn't include, for example, Switzerland and Norway and Iceland, but they are very closely associated. We are getting to that later. The EU is this part, so it's just from 2009 or 2007, so it's just 10 years old. People confuse it a lot with other things. The Germans used to know it under the EWU, what's that? European Economic Union. But it has, in fact, a long history because it started as a military and with a military treaty and a couple of police-related things. And it got more and more countries involved, and in 2007, the Lisbon Treaty actually is a base for the EU how it is right now. The EU itself consists of 28 countries. They are much more treaties than just the European Union. And we have a little nice picture taken from Wikipedia to actually explain the different treaties a little bit. So this is just the EU. The Eurozone is only a couple of states. There are some states missing. Then we have some internal corporations, for example, the Visegrad Group. These are the more Eastern European countries, the Baltic Assembly, Benelux, and the Common Travel Area between Ireland and the UK. Then we have the European Economic Area, which also includes Liechtenstein, Iceland, and Norway. Those three countries have a treaty with Switzerland called EFTA, and we also have the European Customs Union, which includes Turkey, San Marino, Monaco, and what's the other one? Andorra. The Schengen area is a couple of countries from the European Union, but also the EFTA countries. So, yeah. Then we have the Council of Europe, and this is the important bit here is the Council of Europe and the Council of the European Union is often confused. So this is a treaty of 47 countries, including Russia and some other states that are not part of the European Union. So this is a completely different treaty. And then we have a couple of more things that are related to the Eastern, or to countries that are not part of the EU or that want to get inside the EU, and before that they are in other treaties in order to prepare for those things that they have to have in place in order to get member of the European Union. But we are only focusing on the European Union. The other stuff is just to understand what it is all about. So I already mentioned the Lisbon Treaty, so there are a couple of things, or to make it really confusing, the European Convention of Human Rights was actually done by the Council of Europe and not by the European Union. But this is now part of the contract, or of the treaty. It also defines the responsibilities that the EU actually has. And things like, you might have heard of the European Citizen Initiative, that enables people to have petitions and things. And a couple of other things that are actually quite helpful. For example, that the civil society has a better possibility to influence, and also that the European Parliament has much more rights on, or like a better say when it comes to regulation. Our base is actually Article 11 that says that the institutions should include the civil society, and based on that, we are included in a couple of those policy cycles. Just to explain briefly what the three main parts of European lawmaking are. It starts with the citizens. They vote for the European Parliament in European elections. So this is a direct election to the Parliament. Then the citizens also elect their national parliament, and it's more or less the same in most countries, that the national parliament elects the national government. This gets part of the Council of the European Union automatically via the treaties. They recommend the European Commission to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament agrees or disagrees to the Commission proposed by the Council. This is basically what these three, how these three parts are, or these three institutions are constituted.
Okay. So let's start with the.
Ich mache das
no,
okay.
Ich mache das hier. The European institutions. So the European Parliament is the first of the European institutions that we want to introduce to you tonight. Contrary to Bundestagskomitees, most of the Parliament's work is actually live streamed. There are 751 parliamentarians, and they work in 20 main committees and 2 subcommittees. And every political group has a coordinator, and then for each and every committee, there's also a secretariat that organizes the work, the discussions, the votes, and so on. And then every political group has also a secretariat, which is then, of course, more political. And each and every member of the European Parliament can have between 0 and a couple of assistants. And the assistants of the parliamentarians are really very important because they know, well, most of the times better than their bosses, the details of the dossiers. Well, because parliamentarians really have so many dossiers to oversee that they cannot be an expert in every one. So this is the composition of the European Parliament. As I said, 751 parliamentarians. And the blue group here is the EPP, the European People's Party. It's the Conservatives, which includes the CDU, for example. Then we have the S&D, the Social Democrats. They have 190 parliamentarians, and well, since the 2014 elections, these 2 big groups often form a big coalition. Then there's also the Green Group with 50 members. It also includes 1 pirate, Julia Reda. Then we have the ALDE group, the yellow ones here, which they are the liberals, and they also include, for example, the FDP and D66 in the Netherlands. Then there's also the European United Left with 52 seats. And yeah, all these right wings, EFDD and ENF. And this is the composition by country. And surprise, surprise, the big member states have a big influence. But yeah.
Yeah, or like the 5 biggest member states, France, UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain, they have half of the seats. But it doesn't mean that much that you would expect, because this is not, they don't speak for their country, they speak for their country and for their political ideas. So it's not really how it looks like, but still it is like an interesting thing to see in my point of view, that these 5 countries are actually really the half of the parliament.
So yes, so as I said, there's 20 committees and 2 subcommittees in the parliament, and for digital policies, the dark bluer ones here are actually the ones that are most important for us. Those are the LIBE committee with civil liberties, justice and home affairs questions, then the ITRE committee, industry, research and energy, the IMCO, internal market and consumer protection. Unfortunately, it's mostly more IM than CO that's being discussed in there. And then there's also, well, international trade. They discuss trade agreements like TTIP, TISA, and also at the time, well, a couple of years ago, ACTA. And yes, so every member of the European Parliament can be in charge of a dossier, and they are then called the rapporteur, because they are then reporting about the dossier in plenary to their colleagues.
Just one point. One point, but this is important. Usually in parliaments like the Deutsche Bundestag, the fraction is responsible for this, so you have a completely different way how you approach people there. So they are really like the responsible persons for the dossiers. So this is like a very interesting thing.
Yeah. And then also the political groups can each have their own rapporteur. They are then called shadow rapporteurs. And well, when the parliament discusses legislation that is being proposed by the European Commission, they can modify the text, and they discuss these amendments in so-called shadow meetings. And these often take place behind closed doors, and it's not a very democratic process. One example for the data protection regulation that just finished, Jan-Philipp Albrecht from the Greens was the rapporteur for that one. Yeah.
So now we come to one of the councils, the Council of the European Union. This is, as I said, not to confuse with the Council of Europe. This is the governments of the European member states, or the member states of the European Union. But this is actually the heads in terms of, this is a meeting of the heads of state, isn't it? Yeah, okay. So for us, more important are the Council of Ministers. Is that richtig? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm also confused from time to time about the okay, I have changed the talk, so the slides are a little bit confused. So we don't know much about how the 150 working groups are working and how they are really organized in terms of, we don't know much details. There are some people that talk with us about it, but it's not really a very transparent process. And we don't really have to do a lot with them. It's not really easy, if possible at all, to lobby them. To lobby this type of group, you have to go to the member states and lobby the the national government or the national parliament.
I mean, we don't even know who is actually sitting in these 150 working groups. They don't publish their minutes, and they don't publish documents and so on.
So it's a little bit of a black box. Yeah. The presidency has a very special role. So during the time of the presidency, I think they don't have a vote, but they can push their agenda forward. So, for example, the UK pushes data retention, which is another good example. Netherlands would like to push an encryption policy. So they can have a big influence because for half a year, they are in charge of organizing all the meetings, and so they can set an agenda, and this is very like an interesting part of the council. The political composition is a little bit different than the parliament, and that reflects like how the European member states or like what governments are there. The important thing to understand is for most Germans, for example, yellow and or like the liberals are something like left pro like liberals, but many of those are right liberals. So they are like, for example, in Belgium, the liberals are actually right-wing people. So that it looks like as if there's a majority from the left, but it is not. It is clearly not. It is like a majority for the right wings. The third institution that we were talking about is the Commission. The Commission is the only institution that can actually introduce a law. There's no other one that can say, okay, here, this is like a text, and this is going to become law. It also, it's like 27 commissioners, we will come back later to it, that have like different responsibilities for like different parts of policies that are going to be introduced. And they also ensure the correct implementation on European level, but also on member state level. So you can also go to the Commission if you see that the implementation is wrong in the member state. The Commission itself is very different, or the Juncker Commission is very different to the Commission's design over the last years, because Juncker introduced some like vice presidents, which are actually all from small member states, and then like normal commissioners. The idea behind that is that if you take, for example, Andrus Ansip, who is responsible for the digital single market, which is one of the biggest and most important dossiers that we have, oversees the policies from like several commissioners, and from some they have to report, or at least he gets to know about everything that goes on in like other parts or like with other commissioners that are somewhat related to that big dossier. The political composition is pretty much like the one from the council. The difference is, or like the conservatives have a little bit more. It means like half of all of the commissioners are from the EPP. There is like Jonathan Hill from ECR, yeah, and so this is like, and you see like 4 people from 8 are also in the president or vice president position. The work of the commission is divided into so-called directorate generals. There are 27 of them. Some of them have to do with actual like real policy topics or politics, and others are more for certain services that are provided by the EU, for example, digital or so. There are a couple of ones that we deal a bit more with, like trade, for example, or DJ Connect is one of the more important ones, and also with the Secretariat General for general things.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
High-level decisions. Yeah. Okay. And besides, well, these three institutions that we just talked about, there's also a couple of other advisory bodies of the EU. For example, we have the European Economic and Social Committee, which represents organized civil society. And then also the European Committee of the Regions. Also a very important body for us is the European Ombudsman. Currently, the European Ombudsman is Emily O'Reilly, who investigates maladministration of the institutions. And, well, this means that citizens can go to the Ombudsman and file complaints if they see that the institutions don't work correctly. And she really rocks the boat because, well, she has been pushing for greater transparency of the institutions, greater transparency in trade negotiations. For example, she opened a public consultation recently on transparency in the TTIP negotiations. And she also pushed for whistleblower protections in the EU institutions. And, well, the agencies are legally separate from the EU institutions. They're independent and have been created to just fulfill certain roles within the EU legislation. Then we have also, well, for digital policies, very important is the BEREC, the Body of European Regulators for Electronic Communications, who is now working, for example, on producing net neutrality guidelines in order to, well, tell the member states how they have to implement the new net neutrality regulation. But we also have the EDPS, the European Data Protection Supervisor, who gives advice and opinions on draft laws and how they can affect our right to privacy. Then there's also very important to mention the Court of Justice of the European Union. It's the highest court in the Union. And, well, individual citizens cannot go directly to the court, but a national court can refer a case to the CJEU. And you might remember the Data Retention Directive. After 8 years of abuse of our privacy rights, the court actually declared that it was illegal in 2014.
So now we know all of the institutions, and this is we will come back to how laws are made a little bit later, but to get a roundup of everything, the way that that regulation or directives are pushed is that the Commission proposes legislation. The Council and the Parliament both formulate and amend their own positions and proposals. They either agree or they don't agree, and then it gets to the trilogue where they negotiate and discuss the regulations. There are a couple of interesting aspects of it, but we will come back later to it. So this is just a very, very brief overview. So the other part of policy making is the influence that third parties have to the actual policy making, and there are basically two groups. It's like lobbyists and advocates. The main difference is that advocates lobby for for human rights or for things that have no business model, while most of the lobbyists lobby for business models in one way or another. There is a discussion in the council, in the commission, saying, yeah, but companies are also civil society. That is true, but that is still something different because they are normally lobby for a business model. There are transparency rules in the EU, so in order to have a good and successful lobbying, you should register or in the transparency register. That means that you get a couple of informations about future regulations and consultations. It is also necessary to get an easy access or an access badge. They call actually shit-brown badges. In order to have an easy access to the parliament without asking a parliamentarian or an assistant to get access. Yeah, and there are lots and lots of organizations like from industry, but also some AstroTurf organizations that pretend to be civil society, but they are in fact not. The transparency register itself is like an online register, so you can register there. It needs to be renewed every year, and then there's like a lot of like information that you have to provide. For example, if you are an organization, you have to fill in your financial background and stuff like that, and your affiliations. The groups that are registered are roughly 9,000. Half of them are in-house lobbyists and trade people, and NGOs are roughly a third. Yeah.
Yes, so let's give you an example of an NGO, well, my NGO that I'm working for in Brussels, and how we are trying to influence policy making. So we have an office in Brussels, and we are the umbrella organization of European digital civil rights groups from across Europe. And we were founded in 2003 in Berlin, actually, as European Digital Rights. And one of the founding members was the CCC, but there was also Privacy International, Bits of Freedom from the Netherlands, and today we are 31 organizations in total. So we were founded with the idea to influence digital policies at the EU level, because at the time already these groups understood that once the policies are being adopted at the EU level, it's often too late to well, have any changes once the laws hit the member states. So yeah, we focus on defending human rights in the digital environment, and we also function as an early warning system. So we monitor the plans of the European Commission and the European institutions, and we alert our national members that, well, things like the data protection regulation are coming up and that these things are important to work on. Yes. Well, we also draft position papers then, of course, and we also propose our own amendments to the draft laws that are on the table. Our 4 key priorities right now are data protection, surveillance, copyright, and net neutrality, but we also work on horizontal issues like trade or privatized law enforcement, because these 2 topics come up in all of the 4 key areas. So the Commission has kept us super busy recently in the past months. There were, I think, 12 consultations since last year. And consultations are really, really important if you want to get involved at policy making at the EU level. Yeah, because it's really important to assure that not only industry responds to those, but also citizens.
And also, the people actually really read that. So, and very often you have like an event after consultation where they invite all people that actually responded in order to ask questions or have a discussion about certain aspects of your answers. So this is really important.
And, well, unfortunately, sometimes the Commission constructs public consultations in a way that is a bit difficult for citizens to answer. For example, last year there was a public consultation on the EU-US trade agreement TTIP, but you had only 90 minutes in an online session to respond to a rather complicated set of questions before you were kicked out again of that session. So our job is also to create answering guides for citizens and help everybody respond to the Commission. Yes, so let's give you an overview of the policy timeline and how laws are actually being made in Brussels. Because, well, now you know who the players are and where the discussions take place. Now we can show you how exactly the policy making works. So everything starts usually with a policy debate, public debate. For example, people complain that, well, data protection rules are completely outdated and they need to be adapted to the digital age. Then the public debate becomes a policy debate in the European institutions. And during the policy debate, the Commission usually announces a legislative plan in so-called roadmaps and in its annual work program. And during the policy debate, it also launches the public consultations and so on, where everybody can provide input. So as an example, the General Data Protection Regulation was kicked off already in 2011. At the time, in January 2011, EDRI responded to that consultation. And then, after that consultation, the Commission starts drafting internally. And then there's also an internal deadline, an internal period for the Commission in order to get comments from all of the other Commission services. And this is called the inter-service consultation. And this is very interesting because during this period, you often see leaks, because it's a way for different services of the Commission to lobby each other as well. Because if one part of the Commission is not happy with what the other service did that is in charge of drafting the law, the text is very likely to be leaked. For the data protection reform, for example, the Americans were super actively lobbying the Commission during this phase, and they placed some phone calls at a very high level, just very shortly before the deadline of the inter-service consultation. And this then had the result that the text was watered down even before it came out, because simply some of the Commission services issued negative opinions about the text that was prepared at the time by DG Justice. And here in the lower part of the graphic, you see how EDRI works. So during the internal phase of the Commission, we also do some advocacy work, and we try to meet people in the Commission. And then the proposal comes out, and the Commission, you need to know, is working according to the so-called principle of collective responsibility. So the decisions are taken collectively by the College of Commissioners, and once this proposal or position is adopted, the entire Commission needs to defend it. And for the data protection regulation, it actually published the text in 2012, so exactly 1 year after the public consultation took place. And what the Commission is also doing is it is drafting impact assessments of the planned measures in order to show that the proposal is effective and that it is in line with, for example, fundamental rights. But there can also be exceptions to this rule. For example, the anti-terrorism directive that is currently on the table was drafted in only 2 weeks, and there was no impact assessment. And the reason was, of course, because of terrorism. Yes, as soon as the proposal is public, the Council and the Parliament start working on the text, and the Parliament is starting to draft amendments in order to modify the legislation. In the case of the data protection regulation, there were almost 5,000 amendments, so there were huge piles of papers everywhere in the rapporteur's office. Then very shortly, the process in the Parliament is that you have one committee in charge of the file, the lead committee, but you also have other committees that are issuing opinions. And these opinions then feed into the work of the lead committee, which then proposes the text to the plenary. And, well, for the General Data Protection Regulation, it was easiest for us to work with the Parliament because, well, as Fukami explained earlier, the other institutions are not that transparent. And so civil society pressure is really much more effective with elected representatives. And then the negotiations between Parliament, Council, and Commission start in so-called trilogues. And the whole process then ends with a decision and the adoption of either a regulation or a directive. A regulation is directly applicable in the member states and cannot be modified anymore. Whereas a directive, actually, the member states have some room of maneuver in order to implement according to, well, the national specificities. Yes. So in December 2015, the European Parliament, Council, and Commission reached an agreement on the data protection rules, and just now, in April 2016, the regulation and the directive were adopted by the Parliament and by Council. So the General Data Protection Regulation took 4 years after the publication of the proposal to be actually adopted. And then it usually takes around 2 years for the member states to implement EU legislation, and the data protection regulation will come in force in 2018. But if one member state does not implement the EU legislation, then the Commission can launch also what is called infringement procedures against the country. For example, as it was the case for Germany with the Data Retention Directive. Yeah, so we're slowly coming towards an end now, and we want to give you just a brief overview of the dossiers that are on the table right now. As we just explained, the data protection regulation is done. The NIS directive has been finished. The Trade Secrets Directive has been finished. Also, EU PNR has been finished. EU PNR is basically data retention. It's a surveillance measure for air passenger data flying in and out of the EU. EU PNR was pushed through very quickly as well after the recent terrorism attacks. Then we have, as an overarching issue, everything related to the digital single market. And ongoing right now is the anti-terrorism directive. Well, the Parliament is supposed to adopt it anytime soon before the summer break. At least that is the plan for now. Then we have also upcoming now the copyright reform. The copyright reform started last year with initiative reports in the European Parliament that were not legislative work, but where the Parliament just issued opinions about how copyright should be reformed to the European Commission. And the Commission will now, hopefully soon, come up with actual legislative text in order to, well, update the rules that are still from 2001 or so. Then also upcoming, we have the Smart Borders package, voluntary measures, ancillary copyright. So it is very likely that the European Commission is going to copy the very bad text from Germany, Leistungsschutzrecht, into EU law. And of course, we will try to oppose this. And the next big fight for privacy on the European level is the reform of the e-privacy directive. The e-privacy directive deals with cookies, trackers, but also encryption. So the lobbyists, the industry lobbyists mostly, are already getting ready in order to yeah, well, they plan to kill the e-directive completely. Yes, so just a couple of examples of fast-track policymaking. As I said before, there can also be exceptions to the rules. So sometimes it does not take 4 years in order for a law or a draft law to become actual EU law. So, for example, the anti-terrorism directive was drafted in only 2 weeks. Parliament is now supposed to adopt it in only 4. There was no impact assessment, so the Commission didn't even show us that the proposed measures were effective. They didn't show any evidence that this would work. And yeah, now it's being rushed through Parliament. But aside from the legislative work of the institutions, there's also from time to time other projects and initiatives that are not part of the general policymaking process, like the EU Internet Forum. So the Internet Forum is a project by the Commission and Europol in order to fight terrorism and also hate speech online. And here they sit down with a couple of companies in order to encourage them to act quickly against, well, potentially illegal stuff online. And this is, of course, highly problematic because, well, the actions that should be the responsibility of the state are now being handed over to private companies. And companies thereby become judge, police, and jury over our communications. Yeah. So this is what's on the table now. So what can you do to keep up with all these things that are happening at the EU level? So there's not really one easy solution. You still have to look around in many different places in order to get the info, for example, from all of the institutions' websites. But you could also read the Adrigram with articles about current policies. There's also a couple of publications in German. Netzpolitik.org also has a couple of articles from time to time about stuff that's going on at the EU level. You can also check out views.eu and Euractiv. Yes.
And there are a couple of projects that help with like visualization or like getting data in terms of like, for example, Open Interest has a huge database of people that are actually like lobbyists or people that are working on certain directives or certain legislation.
Yeah, and PALTRAC is also very interesting. PALTRAC is basically gathering all of the data from the European Parliament's website because it's still not very easy to find, okay, which parliamentarian actually did what work on which dossiers. So PALTRAC tries to combine this all very nicely and neatly into one place. And do you want to do it?
Yeah, so EDRI, as Kirsten said, it's not the only like NGO that is playing with it, or like not dealing with it. There are lots and lots of organizations in the member states that deal with all the issues. And it's one thing to do stuff is to support them either like financially or like really helping them in projects, and they all need help. And what Kirsten also said, it is very important that more people getting in to do more consultations, responding to that, because it is like the more and the better input they have, it actually has an impact. Yeah. The last slide is actually the top 10 advocacy tips. If you want to talk to people in Brussels, I did, for example, a couple of things that were not very nice. For example, I wasn't very nice here, like number 5, because my first engagement was shouting at a parliamentarian, which is never a good idea. But in general, it's really about, being reliable, being honest. It's very important not to bullshit them, but like say, okay, I know about this. In my point of view, it works like that, but this I don't know. This is like, or I don't care, or whatever. But it is really important to, be honest and be consistent and everything in order to have success in your advocacy work.
Yeah, and you also have to be understanding, especially with the European parliamentarians, because, since they are, politicians, you cannot always ask the impossible of them, because that puts them in a not so nice spot. So you always have to ask for the possible, and you also have to be a bridge builder, especially when you work at the EU level. There are no constant enemies or constant friends. You always have to try to find your allies. And you have to be consistent. You have to ensure that your analysis and the things that you actually want from the people are clear and consistent. And you should be brief, because policymakers don't have time.
Yeah, so that was it from us. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, if you have any. Yes, I think so.
Hello, Klaus Zinser. Sorry. Is it on? Yeah, okay. I have a point or a question, let's say that's about the lawmaking or access to European Union Court in Luxembourg. And let's say my experience is if there is a violation of European Union law, the Commission, it's highly political. They can deny and they just say there was no violation. The European citizens, they can't go to court. And even the Ombudsman once said these infringement proceedings, they are highly political. So where is the democracy in the European Union? And the second point, you made a brief comment that's about this triad processes. I think 70% of, or even more of the EU legislation is now negotiated. There is one parliamentary hearing, the first one, and then it disappears and it's not public at all.
No.
And if you have, I'm sorry. Okay. So first of all, I'm responding to the first question. Yeah? Okay. So you ask whether democracy is. So if you believe in democratic processes, let's say, for example, I don't know if you're from Germany or from Austria. So this is like one thing is the voting of your representatives. So this is a very, very strong thing to do in terms of, like having pressure on people to do something or to complain or whatever. You have exactly the same principle in the EU. The only difference is that the government, like the European, like the Commission is sometimes the European government, and there is not such a strong link between the Parliament in the EU and the government of the EU, like you have in the member states. There are lots and lots of parts that are not very nice and not transparent, especially the trilogue, for example. It's really like you work for 5 years or so on such a dossier, and it can happen that on the last meeting of the trilogue they say, okay, we just put that out and you have no influence on that text whatsoever. So there are still things that are not perfect, but as clearly seen at the beginning with the timeline, it improved over time. So and I believe that there are possibilities to reform that over time, because I think it's actually quite nice structure that we have there that enables us to have influence. We don't have influence to the Council of Europe, for example, not in the same way that we have in the European Union. So it is like a matter of time to do it better and actually to complain and make it public. Sooner or later, it is going to change for the better. I believe in it, so I wouldn't do that if I don't believe that there is a chance to change stuff. Second question.
Yeah, transparency in trilogues. I mean, this is a point that EDRI has also raised so many times already. We have put out position papers on this, and we really harshly criticized that actually once the three institutions meet behind closed doors and decide on text that was not, like, nobody democratically voted for it, then that is, of course, yeah, highly problematic. But I think, well, since the European Ombudsman is also pushing into this direction, lots of other civil society organizations, not only EDRI, are pushing for higher transparency. I think, as Fukami said, there is a great chance that we can change this over time. But you have to be patient and you have to have a very long breath, and you will probably get lots of gray hair or something.
Does it seem like the General Data Protection Regulation took 5 years? It's like a long time. It's just one regulation. Those reforms just take a little bit longer. But I believe that it is going to if we really want to have the EU, we are going to change it. Other questions?
Hi, I was just wondering, why is it so often the case that directives are misinterpreted as regulations within the EU?
Is it the case?
Within the British national press, unfortunately I'm British, so that's often how I read about the EU. Is it willful, or are there very good technical reasons why it could be open to misinterpretation?
The funny thing is that one reason for the talk was to explain people what are all of those words and things that are in the news, and people actually don't know what the Commission is, and what it actually means, and what a directive is, and a regulation and stuff like that. So it can be both. So people are confused because they don't know better. But the other thing that you clearly see in almost all member states, to blame the EU for their own faults, saying, okay, yeah, this is like they push regulation to the EU and then say it's the EU that is wrong. So this is like, in my point of view, the EU has a really bad reputation just because of that. Or it's at least like one reason why people don't like the EU or fear the EU or whatever, yeah, and are actually misinformed. But I don't believe it is like really a big conspiracy behind it. It's more like, it's more, people don't really know and they don't really care. They don't even read Wikipedia if they don't know if it's right or not. So, yeah. Other questions? Okay, then thank you again very much for your attention. And if you have questions or so, you can also ask us afterwards. Okay, bye-bye.